Welcome to another episode of the Spinoza Triad, in which Dr. Richard Miller, Dan Rowland and myself, John Gibbs, discuss philosophy, or at least a broad understanding of philosophy that we try to apply to contemporary issues and cultural trends and occasional films. Welcome especially to our growing audience in the United States and around the world. This week, we start by asking ourselves the question, one of the oldest questions in philosophy: what is truth? And the nature of truth. This might seem one of the simplest ideas, since truth is something we all rely on and hold most dear. We ask ourselves this week if we live in a post-truth world, and indeed post-truthism, and that we are living in times where it is particularly difficult to discern truth, is the starting point of our discussion. We touch upon issues of relativism, apathy, and philosophical theories of truth as they've been understood. I hope you enjoy our discussion.
So what's our question?
Well, Rich, I think our discussion this week, our question this week is what is truth and what is the post-truth world? And particularly I was struck by something, Dan, you sent me recently, an article from The Guardian which made reference to Hannah Arendt's famous book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, in which she points out something I think particularly relevant to, to what's happening right now, unfortunately, particularly when you look at Putin's Russia or indeed any other area of truth manipulation in this world. It's not necessary for totalitarian regimes to simply produce propaganda, convince us of things that might be considered not true, and all the manipulative capacities with which propaganda might be used. But in fact, the reality, says Arendt, is that the main thing is to convince people that there is no truth, to engender in people a sense of despair over truth and apathy, throwing your hands up in the air and saying, well, who knows? No one knows what's really going on. And that is the success of the totalitarian regime. Well, and the question for us, in a way, after that, is whether it's the success of much of our society. Are we actually living in a rash of apathy rather than a post-truth world? We're living in a post-inquiry world, a post-curiosity world, a post-certainty world.
We've got to ask ourselves this question: how did we get into this position in the first place, whereby everyone has an equal voice on the internet? Everyone kind of thinks that their opinion is the same as truth. And that's where we're getting into all sorts of problems, and this idea of selling doubt where there was previously certainty, which is very easy to do when you've unravelled all forms of truth and all forms of knowledge, and it's everyone can just have a free-for-all in terms of what they want to know. Eric Conway says this. He wrote a book called Merchants of Doubt, which is what all these kind of lobby groups have tried to do. And I think he wrote in 1969, tobacco executive wrote, "Doubt is our product, since it is the best way of competing with a body of fact." So if you get everyone to doubt the body of facts, then nothing can be known.
Could we trace this to Nietzsche, genealogy of morals, and the death of God as a symptom? And he said it's a problem. So you've got the death of God as the kind of the ending of absolute certainty, truth in that sense, and a universal kind of idea of truth. And isn't that what he's trying to get at? For him at that period was entering into a kind of more relativized version of reality. The truth is a mobile army of metaphors. That is kind of one of his central ideas, the breakdown of truth.
Yeah, I think it's perfectly reasonable to make or to find Nietzsche as the philosophical origins of the things Dan's talking about here, the propagation of doubt. I mean, I think years ago, I remember, Richard, you introduced me to the lectures of Rick Roderick. Brilliant lectures online on philosophy. And in one of those, he quotes Paul Ricoeur as describing Nietzsche and Freud, and I think it was Marx, as the masters of suspicion. in the sense that each of them propose that the meaning, the essential truth of things, is at least hidden, or suspiciously hidden, is not apparent, either through Marx's idea of dominant ideology or Freud's idea of the hidden subconscious, or Nietzsche for that matter, and his understanding of the certainties of religion having terminated in a sense. Although, because Nietzsche is not, although he's seen as the originating postmodernist in many ways, he wouldn't share the postmodernists' delight in the death of all metanarratives, which, because he essentially he's fearful of meaningless nihilism.
I don't think we're quite there yet. I think a lot of the stuff we've got now, which has been taken on by the right, the alt-right, strangely had its origins in the left-wing movement, which kind of individualized experience against those big meta-narratives that we saw coming out of the early mid-20th century and before, because it gave this idea of individualism. Don't know how this has quite morphed from individual expression to right-wing politics. So how's that shift gone? Because obviously Trump is using a lot of the same language that Abraham Maslow would have used in the 1960s about truth.
I think that's a really good point. I think you can draw a line of connection all the way from Nietzsche to the mid-20th century radical individualism, anarchic, left-wing kind of movements like the hippies and so on, and Timothy Leary. They're not so million miles away. They're not a million miles away from people like Trump and populism. I don't think it's a surprise that people like Ayn Rand and Nietzsche tend to appeal to young people, often rejecting the truths of the past, accepting a world where there is an individual, a necessity for the individual to create their own truths. I think all that fits in very neatly with a world in which the man on his farm with his gun is a kind of hippie. There's a kind of freedom there, the seeking of freedom, that is offered by the anarchist and the anarchic response to a world absent of truth.
It is. It's a more aggressive form of hippie, but it's coming from the same individualistic roots. Yeah, but possibly for different intentions. I don't know whether the hippies were, truly believing in community, or was it really just a means of expressing your own individual needs and desires through the moniker of free love? And was that the precursor to Thatcherism and Reaganism, which was then expressed through the economy rather than through culture? So this was a cultural movement in the 1960s, which led in the 80s to the economic individualism of Thatcherism and Reaganomics.
And it isn't that the hippies were really, they didn't know it, but they were libertarian, Friedrich Hayek, Chicago school economists. They didn't, if only they'd known it, they'd have got on very well with Mrs. Thatcher. But I think they're coming from the same place. They're coming from that death of metanarrative. They're coming from the world that Nietzsche predicted, which is a world of, the big certainties. If you live in 1950s and 60s, what are the big certainties? What science is going to answer things? Well, the wheels are coming off that. And then, the atomic bomb, the buggering up of the environment. There's all sorts of ways in which globalization, the fraternity of mankind, all those big ideas are starting to fall. And the previous generation had promised a search for truth.
And then we're left with this thing which is post-truth, where we've just got a bit of rubble to kick around and pick up a few bricks and say, that's my truth. Yeah, the old edifice of truth that used to be for previous generations. You might have a little brick and say, this is my truth, which is kind of meaningless. My truth is kind of a meaningless thing. You might as well, this is my emotion. This is how I'm feeling.
Philosophically then, if we just pause on that, traditionally, what does philosophy say about truth? If we wanted to say that structural, linguistic, inherent a priori truths, Mathematics would be one, wouldn't it? All bachelors are unmarried. There's a truth.
That's a truth. It's got to be truth by its own definition. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. But that search for ultimate truths and Hegelian truths of movements of things through time. What does Hegel call it? Hegel call it the spirit or the Geist. Yeah. It in a sense is only the pursuit of Plato's forms. It's that kind of philosophy which says there is an ultimate truth out there. And our little pursuits of truth are just trying to open doors on that truth. Or is truth ultimately privatized, and truth is your own individual truth, and you can come to yourself to some kernel of some particle of truth.
John, could you just explain the forms there? So how does that work then?
Well, if Plato's forms Plato's idealized forms, so that the world of everything I say, justice or honesty or virtue, is simply an imperfect reflection of perfect forms of justice and virtue. We see shadows. It's the cave. It's the parable of the cave. So you're looking in the cave, and you see in our world we see shadows of truth.
Right. So I suppose someone would ask, why can't we just see truth then? Why do we only see? And I suppose Plato would say, because we just see manifestations of truth. We don't see truth itself. We see manifestations of justice or injustice. We don't see justice walking across the street. Or we can't see justice. We know justice exists or beauty exists because we see examples of beauty, but we don't actually see beauty itself through the examples. Is that kind of what Plato's saying?
Yes, so you recognise some of the attributes of beauty in this imperfect world because you have some sense of perfect beauty or the form of beauty, which imperfectly reflects into this world, the shadows. Well, it's not a million miles away from the scientific project. If the scientific project says something like, through science we'll uncover and greater truth. A bit like someone digging in sand and you find a little corner of something and you think, oh, that's a battleship. And then someone says, no, it's an elephant. You say, well, one of us is going to be right. If we keep on digging, we'll eventually say, there's the elephant, there's the battleship. And there'll be lots of mistakes on the way. But one day science will uncover the truth of the universe. So it's not Plato's ideal world, but it's a perfect truth that exists if we keep pursuing it.
Isn't science just a method, though? It's not really a metaphysical thing. It's just a method. It's an approach to using our senses to come up with certainty through repeated experimentation.
Yeah, but ultimately, the ambition of science is metaphysical for some scientists, or for the sort of modernist project of science. You'd have certainly thought that. I remember, apparently in the 19th century, there was a project to write history books, like the history of the world in 25 volumes, the history of Britain in 50, And there was a belief that you'd finally do it. You'd write the definitive history, and that would be the end of history as a subject. Not the end of history as in...
Didn't we get that book in was it The End of History? Who wrote that? It's 1989, wasn't it?
Well, the end... Well, yeah, not in that sense. In that sense, maybe. Francis Fukuyama. That's the Hegelian sense of history. You're going to achieve a society that you kind of don't need to improve upon. This is as far as it gets. This is as good as it gets. Well, those are metaphysical ideas, aren't they? Because they assume truth. They assume a kind of, this is the way it was meant to be, or there's a goodness in the universe. There's a Geist working through time, or there's a logos, or God maybe.
Because I think Aristotle kind of takes a more practical view, because he doesn't like the metaphysical stuff that Plato goes on about, and comes up with the famous correspondence theory. Our experiences correspond with the facts. As a collective, we collectively have experiences, yes, which have their own philosophical problems in themselves, but collectively through our experience and language, we can assess what the facts are, because collectively we have collective experiences about X, Y, or Z. So collectively we look at a glass of water and we say, yes, that is a glass of water. We don't need to add the extra thing, which is what we talked about the other day. We don't say it's true that this is a glass of water, because the word truth doesn't add anything to that statement of truth. Because we just say, collectively, we're saying that's a glass of water. So for Aristotle, our collective statements, which correspond with our experiences, become the facts. So that's what facts are. So you end up just saying, well, are we all experiencing this together? Yes, we are. That's a fact. Obviously, those facts change, because you could say, you can have a false fact, but, a peasant tilling the fields outside Milton Keynes in 1530 would say it's a fact that God created the world and the world is flat. That was the collective experience. So you have a paradigm shift, things move on in this correspondence theory. But that's how people arrived at facts before the internet and before post-truth.
For anyone listening to this, the correspondence theory just is how we, in ordinary everyday life, deal with truth. It comes from Aristotle. It's a simple observation. It doesn't sound particularly exciting, If I think something or say something, and there's a thing out there that it corresponds to, then that must be true. So it's what's used in a court of law. Is this man guilty? Did he commit the murder? There's the blood on his hands. He was seen at the thing. We're increasingly trying to make a correspondence between the assertion that he did the murder and some kind of facts that suggest that he was there on the day that he was seen stabbing someone, and say, well, yes, therefore we've arrived at the truth because what we said, what we asserted, what we accused corresponds with what actually happened. But the problem becomes when we human beings do that thing which we tend to do, which is to try to induce ideas from the things we see, which are generalised, so we can know they're true even without our own observation. This is what Hume called the problem of induction. The medieval peasant, as it were, living in a pre-truth world, if we are taking the post-truth idea to mean truth existed in some sense around about the time of the scientific enlightenment. We're living in a post-truth world now. The medieval peasant living in his pre-truth world induced from an observation that his correct observation, perfectly reasonable observation, that the horizon appeared to be flat, since you'd have to get on a very high mountain to see that it curved, into the generalised inductive reasoning that the world itself was flat. And so, things we can't understand, we induce into a generalised rule that this must be caused by gods and spirits and so on. This is not a bad rule of thumb in a sense. We're going to arrive at an awful lot of ridiculous ideas, but it at least gives us a pattern on which to understand, a pattern to impose on the world. This pattern seeking is probably as good a means of seeking truth as looking at clouds and trying to discover whether there are faces in them and asserting that there truly are faces in them.
I was going to say, isn't it more probability, isn't it? I mean, it's to be able to predict, isn't it, I think, rather than certainty.
And I think that's the basis on which most truth is sought, a matter of probability. Certainly scientific truth is never based on certainty. Certainty is a rare commodity, and it may not be the most necessary feature of truth. For most of the time, that a thing is most likely true is for us, therefore, good enough as true. Truth, therefore, in ordinary life is a reasonable best guess based on what we've seen before us. And I think Hume admitted that as well. If you assume that an approaching tiger is best run away from, or at least climb a tree, then that's actually a good means, a good response to something you can't actually know that it would attack you. But, on the basis of probability, I'd run away from the approaching tiger.
Traditionally, like a correspondence theory with this common sense, really, isn't it? It's about agreed consensus. I was just wondering if we now have so many sort of counter-narratives and so many stories, largely down to technology, the world is so much more immediate And sociologists don't talk about time and space being compressed. So things happen around the world instantaneously, and we get to see them. There are so many stories that something like that correspondence theory, it can't work because it never had to account for so many different viewpoints, so many different perspectives. It's just split between objective truth. Can you have an objective truth, or is truth relativized? Is it relative? It's really, that's what you're saying, isn't it?
Well, relative to your experiences. But I suppose to a fine line, what you're saying is, sorry to interrupt you, is to kind of say that those relative statements, are they relative to a collective experience or a private experience? And then you're into we'll perhaps talk about Wittgenstein shortly, because that comes into about the problems of private language and truth. But I was going to say, raising from what you're saying there about this, it's a great point you're making about there's so much truth hitting us, it's like we're having 10 weather systems happening every single day. We don't know what the weather is. So here we got so many competing stories and ideas which are being fed to us through our little devices in our hands, that we don't have enough time to establish where the truth is corresponding with the facts, and vice versa. And also the propensity of counterfactual facts on the internet everywhere. If this happened, this might, and rumours and uncertainty. But that's a good point, Rich, you're making there. So much information, we don't have enough time to digest it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I was going to say that part of the problem is that that human beings have a tendency to believe things. And that just to end that statement there. Human beings tend to want to believe things. So and if they relied a little more on correspondence, and there are all sorts of problems, as you say, with correspondence, but we tend to quite readily disregard correspondence to believe things because the person that tells it to you tells you this thing is charismatic and convincing. There are a lot of examples of that in history. So why did you believe this madness? Because the person told me it was charismatic, was convincing, or because of you wanted to believe it. It's a sort of psychological desire to believe stuff. So we are very, very easily distracted, lied to, conned. The whole con man kind of procedure relies on this one born every minute, and you can fool people really easily. This seems to be a central problem for us humans.
Springing on from what you were saying there, John, there's the next field of philosophy which tries to deal with those problems of ideas and counterfactuals and counter-narratives is coherence theory. But the idea that is, rather than just making sure our collective experiences are in sync with the statements we're saying which are true, coherence theory is saying that we need to be able to make sure that the ideas which we're listening to and assessing to be true or false need to be coherent. And if we can spot through our intelligence things which are not coherent, we then say, or our reason, I should say, we then say that's not true because it's not coherent, and you'll be able to express why it's not coherent. So
But Dan, that's largely contingent on the worldview, though, isn't it? Someone's worldview or perspective will say whether or not something is coherent, because it'll be coherent to the dominant narrative that the person lives by. Like, if somebody's is very religious and somebody is atheist, they will have a different worldview, and therefore what makes something being coherent will be contingent on that.
Yeah, you've got a point there. Obviously, Christianity or Islam are coherent in themselves unless you're not a Christian or a Muslim. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, or an atheist. You'll have a different idea of what's coherent. Just quickly, John, on what you were saying about belief and certainty, because I think that's a problem. I think when you said about human beings have an urge or a tendency to believe, I agree. There's a hardwiring in there for belief, and I think that the thing about truth is it offers some version of certainty, and I think security, that builds in it psychologically, a security with people, which is why I think we talked about religion there, where you see people going back to religion. Often, I don't know the data now, but I'm pretty sure you have a lot of second generation people moving over to this country that go back to religion, and you'll see, a rise in religious faith because it offers a version of truth, which is, it taps into this sort of hard wiring of humans wanting to believe, and offers a security there, a security against perhaps the uncertainty that we see on a daily basis through media.
Well, I suppose that's where this whole postmodern, post-truth world exists at the moment, whereby people say that something is true to me.
Yeah, I really think that's an important point, Rich, there, that the return to religion, the daughters wearing the hijab when the mothers didn't, the boys rediscovering religion, that their parents to some extent more secular, or discovering a certainty in nationalism and a certain identity about your ethnicity or your national identity, or the kind of alt-right certainty. This search for certainty in an age of uncertainty, or a kind of rational irrationalism. You know far more than ever before in human history. You have far greater knowledge at your disposal, and yet you actually know the truth of that knowledge far less. You're less certain about the truth in an age of multiple knowledge sources and the provision of knowledge. Which is where I think, Dan, you're right. You're absolutely right, Dan. That is almost, you could almost call that the postmodern sort of condition, or certainly the condition of our age, the my truth, in the absence of truth, and yet in the presence of so much information. Then you can devise your own irrational rationality and come up with it's as much if the effects of a mass media tidal wave is that you doubt the sources of just about everything, then you produce your own understanding.
Going back to Plato, when you're talking about belief, so if it's going to be a piece of knowledge, in philosophical terms, Plato would say you can't just have belief by itself. He's got the tripartite view of knowledge, which is that belief is an essential part of knowledge or truth. So if you say something is known, like I know that there's a television before me or a monitor screen before me, I've got to have justification, which I think we've kind of talked about already. You've got to have belief. You can't know something you don't believe. And it's got to be true. So it's called JTB, Justified True Belief. Now, there are all sorts of problems with this, but that's the essence of when we're establishing what is true or what can be known. You've got to put it through the Platonic filter there of JTB, Justified True Belief.
So are we saying, so in contemporary terms, truth doesn't mean the same as it did, does it? If it doesn't have to be supported, it's just something. Is it more to do with consensus?
I think now with the internet and this, as you said so well, the deluge of information being thrown at us left, right and centre, to the point we can't use these filters anymore, that people are not trusting people who've spent time studying and working hard and becoming experts in certain fields, because there's so much information that they're moving towards the belief and kind of leaving justification and truth aside and jumping to all sorts of strange conclusions that, when challenged, they don't need to justify. They don't need to say it's true. They just say, well, I believe it. That's it. That's the end of the discussion. As soon as you have that, you have the recipe for totalitarianism, because nothing can be discussed. Nothing can go through those filters that we've discussed this morning. You can't really assess what's true and what's not. We just say, well, it's down to you. And then someone will come and pick up the pieces, like a dictator or some demagogue.
So, Dan, to pick up what you said earlier, that we have this perfectly reasonable idea of truth originating way back. I mean, go back to Plato. Justified true belief. A thing is true if you believe it and you have the evidence for it, and the thing itself turns out to be real and true, then that's a reasonably good filter. And it's the one we're going to use in everyday life. It's the one that's going to be in the courts of law. You're going to point to evidence and so on. That is ordinarily our method of verified truth. There's a thing on the BBC right now called what's it called? Verified, where they have to preface the news. I mean, if it tells you something about our times, if the BBC have to have a news programme called Verified, in other words, this bit of news, which you might not think is true, is actually true. We double checked.
It depends how it's done, though, John, isn't it? I think if it's done in a critical kind of, if it's done critically, rationally, and based on evidence, then no, I agree with you. I think that maybe the problem in contemporary society is those bits are missing. That we just decide that this is the truth and yours isn't, and then we end up with a relativized. Well, it's just your truth and I have my truth. Is that kind of what you were saying, Dan, about personal truths becoming public?
Without going through the things which have served previous generations so well and led to all the progress that we've had, and we've suddenly say we don't need experts anymore, we don't need a body of knowledge anymore, we don't need truth anymore, truth is entirely personal. Of course, people have personal experiences and deeply held convictions and emotional perspectives, but that's different from things which are held to be true in a general sense. But I think at the moment we're confusing the general with the particular, thinking the personal is the general. And that's why we're getting into all sorts of problems with strange discussions in culture wars and whatnot, which is leading us into a situation where people can't have proper discussions anymore about things which would have been discussed rationally and coherently.
But there's not the truth. There's a power relationship there as well, isn't there? There's a relationship of power there. I mean, that's. I always thought that was. I don't know how much Wittgenstein Foucault read, but I think that there are definite crossovers there, aren't there? When we start talking about language, and we start talking about truth, and then there's definitely a power relationship. By that I mean, if a wizard comes and tells me something, and then a scientist tells me something, I'm probably going to take on board the scientist. The wizard. I had to pause there. Yeah, the scientist.
Well, I don't know, Rich. You might be right to go with the wizard. I'd go with the wizard if an authoritative wizard appeared before me and was able to do genuine proper magic. I'm with the wizard every time. I think I want to speak up for our age, or at least put the age in context, in case we start to veer into things ain't what they used to be. I would guess that the measure of truth throughout human history has tended to be consensus. In other words, most people believe the things that people believe around them believe. And that's been true more in the past than possibly today. And although we talk about personal truth and invention of truth and individualised truth, I'm not sure I want to go back to an age of collective truth, when truth was imposed and unassailably based upon the consensus views of the majority, or of the authority, or of those, as you point out, Rich, those in power. Power has dominated truth-giving, and all truth has been mediated through those in power. And so there's something to be said for the unmediated, individualised truth. But in an age of unmediated, individualised truth, you do need the kind of critical thinking, empowered individual with the intellectual capacity and tools to be able to differentiate between those things which cannot be justified and those things which are purely matters of opinion. And not only do human beings have a tendency to believe, to want to believe things, they want to believe them and they attach those beliefs to their own personal identity. And as soon as people assert a truth that is their own and is their own identity, and they apply no critical reasoning to it, or for instance, it's impossible to argue with someone who has a belief and the entirety of that truth that they perceive is based upon belief. If I say there's a pink elephant floating above my head and it only speaks to me and only I can see it, then it's quite impossible for you to defeat that argument. I might be right. Maybe there is such a thing as a pink elephant floating above my head that only speaks to me. And according to the parameters of my belief, it is unassailable.
But John, that's what I'm talking about. It's now that's what's happening everywhere. Everyone's got their pink elephant above their heads, and because I believe it to be true, nothing could be said. But all that we've talked about this morning is that truth is more complicated than that. You've got the belief part of it, but it's not justified and it's not true. We've already established this morning how people, even though there's problems with it, you can establish a form of truth and a form of justification. We're not necessarily going into the problems with it this morning, but in other words, truth involves other people. You said the other day when we were having a chat about Wittgenstein and the beetle, you can't just have a private language, which is kind of what you're saying there. You can have a private language about an experience of a pink elephant above your head.
I think that if you take perhaps a postmodern perspective of truth, and rather than have it as a kind of metaphysical kind of thing, if you just then approach it in a very pluralist sense, so you're just dealing with individual facts or statements or positions, rather than perhaps the days of an overreaching concept of truth are not as strong as they used to be. A lot of the issues, I think, with these philosophical definitions of truth, it's trying to because I think we said at the beginning that truth was in something, wasn't it? There has to be something for it to address. So I wonder if something to be true, and I wonder whether or not the strength of sort of postmodernism or relativism in this sense is to address individual areas of truth and then test against the available evidence we have, and that will give us cultural issues. Perhaps an issue is probably a better way of saying it. Each issue can then be, evaluated critically.
But we've gone full circle there. It's interesting. We've gone full circle. If we just disappear into our own navels, how can we establish meaning? How can we really talk about our own experiences if they're not really shared?
There is a distrust of experts. That's one side of it. But on the other side of it, if we're using the word amateur, or just somebody that understands about evidence, understands technology, and can test claims against that, they surely still have as valid a voice as anyone else.
When you're talking about truth, it's got to be relating to other people. So if you have a private truth, that's not going to be meaningful in any public sense. So would we say that's a different type of truth, or would you say a personal truth is an experience rather than a statement of truth? Like when people arrive at truth, if correspondence theory isn't working, it's at least through language. So you look at a cat and sitting, you're using those verbs, those words, you understand what those words mean in relation to the thing you're trying to describe. Like Wittgenstein said, how does language establish truth? It's through use. So the way the words are used establishes the truth of any utterance that's being said.
Well, I don't think it's a bad thing that we don't agree as much as we used to. In other words, I think there are benefits to this world of post-truth. And it would be because I wouldn't want necessarily to live in a world of truth. I mean, if you lived in a world of truth, 13th century Christendom, then there's a kind of blanket of truth over the world. Clearly didn't exist. Yeah, absolutely. And the Inquisition there, and hell. And if the Inquisition didn't get you in life, then the demons with the red hot pokers up the bum are going to get you. So there's an absolute incontrovertible truth that people are going to, and they're going to ruthlessly enforce it. But if you go back to classical Greece, it clearly is possible to be a skeptic, to be a stoic, to be a a Platonist, and so on, and to be all of those things. And there's a sort of soup of ideas, and you might well have. I mean, what is Socrates accused of? He's accused of subverting youth, you know. And what's he doing to what's he doing to these young people? That what he's doing is he's convincing them that there's not any truth, is he? You don't really know anything. If you try and think things through, you end up wondering what you really knew in the first place. See, maybe he's the first disruptive postmodernist, and yet he's almost a paradigm for how you should view the world. So a degree of postmodern skepticism and doubt in meta-narratives isn't necessarily a bad thing.
So yes, I think what John was saying, it's really good to challenge meta-narratives and old hoary ideas like, from religion or, society. Very good to challenge them. But if you're then left with kind of meaningless bumbling around of people getting more and more angry and disappearing into culture chambers, or echo chambers, I should say, not culture chambers, you're going to end up losing a proper discussion about what is true and what is false. If everyone is saying my opinion is as important as your opinion.
Yeah, it does come back to that Hannah Arendt idea that a very good way to control people is instill apathy and a sense of doubt, because then people say, well, who can tell? You could be right, I could be right, who could know? And you might well say that's one of the problems of the sort of pluralist society, the promotion of liberal values, is that if we all come up with different views, then as you say, no truth can be arrived at, so we end up, anything could be true. However, if you sort of flip that a bit, you could say, well, there was a time when people didn't think tobacco could do you any harm because it's just a sort of powerful, it's a bit of smoke, and the people that said it did harm you were essentially the kind of minority view. I'm thinking of damage to the environment, how once that was considered a bit crackpot, that you could damage the environment, that you could pollute oceans or the air or such like. So there would have been a time when the amateur sense was on the side of good, and there are moments in history when the inexpert has been the person who questions the unassailable truths of the time. Although earlier Dan, you were reminding me of Plato's Ship of Fools, which is his argument against democracy. If you're getting on a ship, you really do want the people that run the ship, the captain and the crew, to be experts in navigation and such like. You don't want people who've never run a ship. He says democracy is not a good idea because you elect people to positions of power who have no expertise. Better to be run by philosophers and experts. It can be a sense of elitism because clearly scientists that have asserted all sorts of things that have turned out not to be true. I mean, or we've been reassured that a problem isn't a problem and it turns out to be a problem. And it may well often be the enthusiastic amateur that exposes that. I mean, there's sort of Erin Brockovich kind of thing.
I think if an amateur comes from the idea of loving something so much that you devote most of your life to it. So they might not have the qualifications or the degrees or whatever, but if they've really conquered a body of knowledge and can demonstrate that, then perhaps that's a valid point. But often people are driven by their emotions rather than their love of a subject. Just because I feel something strongly, I think therefore it's true, which is never an argument.
I don't see a way out of this, though, moving forward. I don't, unless people became... I mean, it's always the way I think we're trying to catch up with technology. I think that's really the spirit of our age, is that technological determinism, whereby, our culture is trying very hard to catch up with technology as it's evolving. And now you're going to have AI jumping in the mix as well. And we're going to have... It's becoming ever more difficult. I just wonder if more critical tools were available to people. Really, I think maybe a modern education should look very different from traditional ones. Modern education should be about just these very things, about being taught critical analysis and evaluation and dealing with evidence and questioning things. Until that happens, I just think that these, in inverted commas, truths, I mean, are just going to become more and more hard to dispute, because people are just going to say, well, no, I believe in it. I think, not the takeaway from this conversation, but one of them, again, I think, is the highlight of the relationship between belief and truth.
Absolutely, yeah. But aren't you're experiencing the sort of, and we all are experiencing the frustration of a world saturated with information, and a lot of human beings who would rather not be Socrates. He must have been an annoying bugger. It must have been really irritating, and you can pick it up in the dialogues of Plato that people are irritated by him. Not only the authorities of Athens who eventually ordered him to kill himself, but there's a desire among humans. Again, I'll go back to my point. I don't want to labour it too much. That all of us would love to know the truth. Wouldn't it be great if someone could tell you something, whatever that truth is? We would all like to think there was an ultimate truth, or that certain things, and there's nothing more enjoyable. We talked about this when we talked about conspiracy theories. Nothing more enjoyable than having a piece of truth that other people don't know. So that desire to be in possession of something. We haven't really, I don't know, we're running out of time, but we haven't really talked about ethics. And because that's in a sense where relativism and anyone's truth is fine breaks down for people like me who might say, yes, I like the idea of skepticism and questioning, but not necessarily when it comes to good and evil and certain actions that I will say going to rule out.
That's a good discussion. Can we have such a thing as a moral fact?
That's a good one. That is a good one.
That could be our next week's discussion. But it goes nicely with what we've been talking about this morning.
It comes on to the other theory of truth as well. We haven't talked about this sort of pragmatic theory of truth, that that the utilitarian view of truth and the rules of ends justify the means and so on. You can come up with rules of truth that seem to govern behaviour.
And there's some really, really interesting stuff to talk about with that. And we haven't discussed aliens.
No, haven't discussed aliens.
Which was on the list. Aliens. Well, I mean, I just thought it was a great case study. But you mentioned the role of the expert. If anyone has seen the Congress thing, you've got experts, like you were saying earlier, pilots, highly trained individuals, and they're actually saying, so yeah, it backs up your point, Dan. They're actually saying that they've seen, and if it was, I don't know, someone, just a guy that from down the road that was just sat in the pub garden and so the fact it was an expert saying it, and they're giving his eyewitness accounts, does it be considered true?
So whilst it's got these snippets of private experiences, even if they're experts, it can't be established as a fact. Whereas the role of the expert and collective experience, I think. Whilst, same thing with COVID. I mean, you had the experts saying this is what's happening. You had so many people saying it's not, until the collective experience matches with the experts, or the experts matches with the collective experience as a meeting point. Then you've got a kind of body of facts.
Absolutely, it becomes fact when it is, as you say, incontrovertibly corresponding with our everyday experience. As fact as anything, as we said earlier, as fact as anything can be, given that it's all in a frame of language and perception. So it's possible that nothing exists and we're all imagining all this, and I'm dreaming you too. But nonetheless, if we want to agree that there is some sort of correspondence between what we see, what we observe, and reality, then when the mothership hovers over the White House, I'm going to say, well, it looks pretty much like they're here. I don't doubt that for a minute. That I'm not there yet, but I'm willing to say, well, why? So again, if I said to you, we said this the other day. If I said to you, I've spoken to the Archangel Gabriel this morning, and I'm not joking. This isn't, this is the absolutely, guys. I've just got to tell you, I've spoken to the Archangel Gabriel. You're going to have to go, he's mad. he's lying, and it's all going to be some sort of ridiculous joke, and I didn't think that was. Or John normally, he seems convinced, but I think long before you think the Archangel Gabriel actually spoke to me, you'd probably say, I want to rule out that John's having a psychiatric episode, which is a kind of Occam's razor, more likely sort of explanation. Yeah, and I'd just like to add that, although I said earlier that we human beings have all sorts of things, that ego and preconceived opinions that we don't like to change, and so on. If someone believes something, they really don't like to have that belief challenged. It's very uncomfortable because that belief becomes part of their identity, and that obscures their ability to look critically or so on. Changing your mind is surprisingly hard, because you have to admit that you were wrong, and you pin so much of yourself on that belief. But on the other hand, I bet, I'd absolutely say this is true, that largely speaking, certainly in the UK and largely across much of the world, human beings are probably an awful lot less stupid than they were. I think if you went, there was a story I read once about in the 18th century, a ship went aground on the coast of Northumbria somewhere, and on board the only survivor from the ship was an ape, an orangutan, and the people of Northumbria, the villagers found this thing, and they decided to execute it after a trial as being a Frenchman. And that brings to an end this episode of the Spinoza Triad, in which Dr. Richard Miller, Dan Rowland and myself, John Gibbs, discussed truth and knowledge and other things, including aliens. I hope you enjoyed our discussion, and you can find it on Spotify and many other platforms, and past episodes of the Spinoza Triad, the occasional conversations of three people interested in philosophy. You can also visit our website. As a postscript, the story of the hanged ape relates to the town of Hartlepool in the north of England. And if you go to Hartlepool today, you'll see the mascot of the football club is a hanged ape. And people in Hartlepool will tell you of the story during the Napoleonic War of the ape that was hung as a French spy. It's highly unlikely this actually happened, but it's become local folklore, and maybe something like it happened. So it may, or may not, be true. Thank you for listening.